One of them passed away with $2.14 in her bank account. One of them was found carrying a cocktail tray in a hotel lobby. These were not forgotten stars. These were the biggest names in Hollywood history. Dorothy Dandridge. In the spring of 1954, the most glamorous building in Los Angeles was the Pantages Theater on Hollywood Boulevard. On the night of the Academy Awards, its lobby shimmered with the jewels and gowns of every major name in the industry. But there was one arrival that evening that stopped the room in a way no other entrance had. Dorothy Dandridge stepped out of her car in a strapless champagne gown, her dark hair swept elegantly, her expression composed and radiant, and walked into a moment that American cinema had never seen before. She had been nominated for Best Actress for her role in Carmen Jones, the first African-American woman in history to receive that honor. The audience inside rose to greet her. The photographers outside called her name until their flashbulbs exhausted themselves. What those photographers could not have imagined, as they documented that extraordinary evening, was that 11 years later, Dorothy Dandridge would be found alone in her West Hollywood apartment with $2.14 remaining in her bank account. The distance between those two moments is not simply a story about money. It is a story about what an industry does when it has finished using someone. At the height of her fame, Dandridge was genuinely, remarkably talented. A performer whose combination of beauty, vocal ability, and dramatic range placed her in a category that Hollywood had no proper framework for. The industry knew she was valuable. What it did not know, or chose not to care about, was how to sustain that value once the particular window of her moment had passed. There is a story told by those who worked with her during this period that Dandridge was invited to test the swimming pool at a Las Vegas hotel where she was performing. When she dipped her toe in the water, the management drained and refilled the pool before allowing white guests to use it again. That is the world she was navigating while trying to build financial security. The roles available to an African-American actress in 1950s Hollywood were narrow to the point of cruelty. Studios would not cast her opposite Caucasian leading men. Major hotels refused her accommodations even while she was promoting her own films. The infrastructure of support and protection that the industry extended to its white stars. The long-term contracts, the grooming for longevity, the careful management of career transitions, was simply not offered to her. Into this void stepped managers and advisors who extracted their percentages while providing little protection. A Las Vegas nightclub investment collapsed and took her savings with it. Legal costs accumulated. The concert engagements that might have provided income became harder to secure as her film profile dimmed. By the early 1960s, Dandridge was making financial decisions driven by desperation rather than ambition. Decisions that a properly supported career would never have required. Those who worked with her later described a woman who maintained extraordinary dignity even as the circumstances around her became increasingly difficult. She dressed impeccably for every meeting. She was unfailingly professional. She gave no outward sign of the financial anxiety that had become a constant companion. In her final months, a film project that might have rebuilt her profile collapsed in pre-production. One more door closing in a hallway that had been narrowing for years. On the 8th of September, 1965, Dorothy Dandridge was found unresponsive in her West Hollywood apartment. She was 42 years old. The cause was determined to be an accidental overdose of a prescribed antidepressant medication. The woman who had made history walked out of that history almost entirely alone and almost entirely without resources. The $2.14 in her account was not a symbol. It was the arithmetic of abandonment. There is a particular kind of rage that her story produces, not at Dandridge, whose grace and talent were never in question, but at the system that built its profits on what she could generate and offered nothing in return when the generating became difficult. The marquees that bore her name belonged to the theaters. The applause belonged to the audience. The money, it turned out, had never really belonged to her at all. She deserved better. The industry she graced knew it and did nothing about it. That is her legacy and her indictment, delivered simultaneously in a number that no one who encounters it ever quite forgets. $2.14. Doris Day. If Dandridge's story is about what an industry takes, the story of Doris Day is about what a husband steals. And the particular cruelty of what happened to America's sweetheart is that it happened in plain sight, in the middle of her greatest success, while everyone was watching. And no one saw it at all. By the mid-1960s, Doris Day was one of the most commercially successful entertainers in the world. Her romantic comedies had made her the #1 box office attraction in America for 4 consecutive years. Her television series was a ratings success. Her recordings continued to sell. She was, by every visible measure, a woman at the absolute peak of a career that had been built on hard work, genuine talent, and an on-screen warmth that audiences found completely irresistible. She did not open financial statements. She did not attend business meetings. She did not review contracts or investment portfolios. Her third husband, Marty Melcher, handled all of it, and she trusted him with the absolute confidence of a woman who had been told, by the world she lived in, that financial matters were not her domain. That was simply how things were done. That was simply what husbands were for. Melcher handled everything. What Doris Day did not know was what handling everything actually meant. The reality, pieced together only after it was too late to change any of it, was this. For years, Melcher had been systematically redirecting her earnings, not into the secure investments she believed were accumulating on her behalf, but into a series of fraudulent schemes facilitated in large part by her own attorney, Jerome Rosenthal. Every film, every television appearance, every recording that had climbed the charts, and every sold-out concert that had confirmed her as one of the most beloved performers in America. All of it flowing through Melcher's hands and out the other side into arrangements that would never return a dollar. In April of 1968, Marty Melcher passed away. Within days, Rosenthal contacted her with information that reordered everything she believed about her own life. The fortune Day had trusted was gone. In its place was a debt of $450,000. And waiting on her desk, unsigned and unreviewed, was a contract for a television series she had never agreed to make and knew nothing about. Those who were with her during the days following this discovery recalled a woman of remarkable composure in the face of something that would have destroyed many people. The Day did not collapse. She did not retreat. She examined what she had been left with, acknowledged the reality of it, and began working. She honored every commitment. She made the television series. She paid back every dollar. The work she produced during this period, driven not by ambition, but by necessity, by the simple arithmetic of debt and obligation, was as professional and committed as anything she had ever done. Years later, a court awarded her $22 million in a malpractice judgment against Rosenthal, a legal vindication that confirmed what she had known from the first moment. This had been done to her. She had not failed. She had been betrayed by the two people most legally and personally obligated to protect her. What makes Doris Day's story resonate so particularly is not the betrayal itself, but her response to it. The sunny, untroubled persona that audiences had adored for 2 decades was not a performance. It was a genuine expression of a woman who simply refused to be destroyed by what had been done to her. The smile that had sold 100 million movie tickets was real. The resilience behind it was realer still. She had been told all her life that someone else would handle the money. Someone else did. And when she discovered what that handling had cost her, she handled it herself. And proved, in the most difficult possible circumstances, that she always could have. Hedy Lamarr. The betrayal that reshaped Doris Day's life came from a husband. The exploitation that consumed our next star came from every direction simultaneously. From the studio that reduced her to a single asset. From the government that took what she invented and gave her nothing. And from an industry that called the most intelligent woman on its lot the most beautiful woman in the world, and meant it as the entirety of what she was worth. Most people, when they think of Hedy Lamarr, think of a face. And what a face it was. The jet black hair, the porcelain complexion, the particular quality of stillness that made cameras find her in any room and refuse to look away. MGM called her the most beautiful woman in the world and put that description on every piece of promotional material they produced. What the promotional material did not mention, what MGM had no interest in mentioning, was that the woman they were selling as a purely visual phenomenon had, working quietly at a desk in her home between film shoots, co-invented a communications technology that would one day form the foundation of Wi-Fi, GPS, and Bluetooth. The most beautiful woman in the world was also one of the most original scientific minds Hollywood had ever accidentally employed. The studio knew about the face. They never bothered to look further. She had come to Hollywood in 1938, fleeing an oppressive first marriage in Austria, negotiating her own contract with Louis B. Mayer aboard an ocean liner with a boldness that surprised even Mayer himself. She arrived with her name changed, from Hedwig Kiesler to Hedy Lamarr, and her value immediately defined. She was exotic. She was breathtaking. She was, in the language of the studio system, a property. MGM cast her as the glamorous foreign temptress in film after film, recycling the same narrow image with the efficiency of a factory that had found one mold and saw no reason to look for another. She was capable of considerably more. The studio had no interest in finding out what that more consisted of. During the early years of the Second World War, Lamarr sat with composer George Antheil and worked out a system for guiding torpedoes using radio signals that hopped between frequencies in a pattern that enemy forces could not intercept or jam. She and Antheil patented the invention in 1942 and donated it to the United States government, declining any personal financial benefit because she believed the war effort required it. The patent expired before the technology was ever deployed. Decades later, when spread spectrum technology became the foundation of the modern wireless world, Hedy Lamarr received a small honorary award in 1997, 55 years after the patent, and the belated acknowledgement of people who had made billions from what she had given away for nothing. The government used her face to sell war bonds. She raised $25 million in a single fundraising period, and used her invention to underpin a communications revolution. She received a $48 weekly pension and an honorary plaque. Meanwhile, the film career built entirely around her appearance began its inevitable decline the moment her appearance became less commercially exploitable. MGM had never developed the infrastructure of a sustained career. No careful transition into character work, no investment in her range, no recognition of what she was beyond the image they had manufactured. When the box office numbers softened, the machinery redirected itself toward the next beautiful face. In 1950, Lamarr held an auction and sold her possessions. She had once spoken of a $7 million income. By the late 1960s, she was living on that $48 weekly pension. Those who encountered her during this period described a woman who had retreated almost entirely from public life. Not broken exactly, but worn down by decades of having been seen without being known. She had spent 30 years in a world that recognized her face the moment she entered any room and had no idea, not the faintest idea, who she actually was. She had given Hollywood her face, and it had taken it gladly. She had given her country a scientific invention, and it had taken that too. She lived her final years alone in a small house in Florida, rarely leaving, rarely speaking publicly. The woman who had been called the most beautiful in the world did not want to be seen anymore. In 2000, Hedy Lamarr passed away at the age of 85, 4 years after finally receiving the Pioneer Award for her wartime invention. The recognition arrived at the very end. The compensation never arrived at all. What she had always wanted, to be recognized for what she could do rather than what she looked like, was the one thing the studio system was structurally incapable of providing. The most beautiful woman in the world deserved to be known as more than that. She always knew it. The world is only now catching up. Errol Flynn Lamarr was exploited by a system that never looked past its first impression of her. Our next star fed that same kind of machine, willingly, spectacularly, with a grin on his face and a glass in his hand. Errol Flynn was many things, but he was never boring. At the peak of his Warner Brothers years, he was arguably the most physically magnificent screen presence in Hollywood. The Tasmanian-born son of a marine biologist who had somehow become the definitive swashbuckler of the American cinema. A man whose smile suggested he knew something delightful that he might or might not share with you. The cameras adored him. The audiences adored him. And Flynn, with characteristic thoroughness, spent everything those audiences gave him. The estate at Mulholland Farm was extraordinary. A working property in the Hollywood Hills that served as the backdrop for parties that became legend. The yacht, Zaka, was something else entirely. 118 feet of custom-built sailing vessel, crewed year-round, maintained at an annual cost that exceeded what most American families earned in a lifetime of work. Flynn sailed her to exotic locations, hosted remarkable guests aboard her, and regarded her with the particular love that men reserve for beautiful things that cost them more than they can afford. He was earning enough, for a time, to sustain even this. Warner Brothers paid him handsomely, and Flynn was a genuine box office force whose name on a marquee meant something to audiences around the world. But the income was matched and then exceeded by the outgoing. The Zaka's maintenance, the farm's upkeep, a Jamaican plantation venture that promised returns it never delivered, tax obligations that accumulated while Flynn redirected every available dollar toward living, multiple marriages, each with its own financial consequence. By the late 1950s, the situation had quietly become critical. Those close to Flynn later described a man who was aware of what was happening and remarkably sanguine about it, as though the spending had always been more important than the keeping. And he had made that choice knowingly. He borrowed money from friends without much apparent discomfort, sold possessions piece by piece, and maintained the persona of a man entirely at ease with the world. Crew members who had worked with him across 2 decades spoke of his genuine warmth, his habit of remembering every name on a set, of staying late to talk with the men who built his sets and sewed his costumes, of the handwritten notes he sent when someone he cared about was struggling. The extravagance was real, but so was the man behind it. In October of 1959, Errol Flynn passed away in Vancouver, British Columbia, at the age of 50. The cause was a heart attack. He was deeply in debt. The Mulholland Farm was sold. The Zaka, the beautiful, ruinous, beloved yacht that had been the most visible emblem of his magnificent excess, was gone. The legend, of course, remained entirely intact. There is something almost admirable in the completeness of what Flynn did. He built a life of extraordinary pleasure and paid for every moment of it. right down to the final accounting. The man who had played pirates on screen lived like one in life, brilliantly, recklessly, and without a thought for tomorrow. Hollywood has produced few more committed performances, on or off camera. If you have found these stories worth your time, we would love to have you with us for everything that follows on this channel. Please subscribe now. We have 10 more names on this list, and some of them will genuinely change the way you think about the golden age you love. Buster Keaton Flynn burned through a fortune and did it deliberately, magnificently, without a single regret. What happened to our next star was something different entirely, and in some ways, much harder to bear. Because Buster Keaton didn't lose his empire through excess. He lost it through trust. In the 1920s, Buster Keaton owned his world. This is not an exaggeration for the purposes of a documentary. He literally owned it, the Keaton Studio on Lillian Way in Hollywood, where he produced, directed, and starred in a series of films that are now considered among the masterworks of world cinema. The General, Sherlock Jr., The Navigator, 1 Week. Films that were not merely successful but genuinely original. Works of pure cinematic imagination that no one else could have made because no one else was Buster Keaton. The Italian villa in the Hollywood Hills was the physical expression of this creative sovereignty. 18 rooms, a swimming pool fed by a waterfall, a private railroad car, fully appointed, parked on grounds that also contained a tennis court, a barbecue pit, and guest accommodations spacious enough for visiting dignitaries. Keaton threw parties there that attracted the most celebrated names in Hollywood. Douglas Fairbanks came. Charlie Chaplin came. The villa was not merely a home, it was a statement. I have built something real, and I own all of it. In 1928, Keaton's management persuaded him to sign with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Keaton later said, in one of the few times he allowed himself to speak bitterly about it, that signing with MGM was the worst mistake of his life. He said it quietly, without drama, which made it worse. The argument his management had made was reasonable on its surface. The resources of a major studio, the security of a long-term contract, the support infrastructure that independent production couldn't provide. What the argument did not convey, and what Keaton did not fully grasp until it was too late, was what the contract actually said. It said that MGM owned his work. It said they decided what he made, who directed it, and how it was cut. It said that the creative sovereignty that had produced the masterworks was over. MGM cast Keaton in mediocre sound comedies that required nothing of what made him extraordinary. His gift, the precise physical intelligence, the deadpan philosophical wit, the extraordinary capacity for both comedy and pathos, was systematically ignored in favor of material that any competent comedian could have performed. He watched his films being made into things he was ashamed of and had no power to prevent. By the mid-1930s, the villa was gone. The studio was gone. The marriage was gone. Buster Keaton was doing vaudeville, the world he had entered as a small child, performing alongside his parents on stages across America before any of the rest of it had happened. He had traveled the entire circumference of a life and arrived back at the beginning with the masterworks to his name and almost nothing else. But those films existed. They had been made. MGM could decide what came next. But they could not unmake the General. They could not unmake Sherlock Jr. The work was permanent in a way that the villa and the railroad car and the salary were not. Keaton understood this, and it sustained him through years that would have broken someone without that understanding. The man who had owned his world lost it entirely, and kept, in the only currency that truly mattered, everything. Clara Bow Buster Keaton built his empire and watched it taken. Our next star never had time to build one. She was too busy making everyone else rich. At the height of her fame, Clara Bow was receiving more fan letters than any other person in Hollywood. 45,000 in a single month. And not one of the people profiting from that number was watching out for her. She was 23 years old, the undisputed queen of the Paramount box office. The woman who had turned the word "it" into a global phenomenon simply by embodying it with such complete, electric authenticity that audiences could not look away. When David O. Selznick analyzed her commercial value, he concluded that a film with Clara Bow guaranteed investors something approaching a 2-to-1 return on their investment. She was not merely popular. She was, by the cold mathematics of the box office, a financial certainty. Paramount knew exactly what she was worth. The salary they paid her reflected what they thought was appropriate for a young woman from Brooklyn, with no powerful family connections and no one watching out for her interests. The distance between those two numbers, what she generated and what she received, was where Paramount's profit lived. Into this situation came Daisy DeVoe, who served as Bow's secretary and was entrusted with her personal finances. DeVoe embezzled from her employer, and when discovered and dismissed, attempted to convert her insider knowledge into an extortion payment. When Bow refused to pay, DeVoe sold a fabricated account of Bow's private life to the tabloids. The resulting trial, which Bow won, exposed the details of her personal life in ways that the press exploited for months. The studio, rather than defending the star who had made them millions, used the scandal as leverage to renegotiate her contract downward. Bow's health collapsed under the accumulated weight of it all. She suffered from what would now be recognized as severe anxiety. She could not sleep. She could not eat properly. The breakdowns became more frequent until, in 1931, she asked Paramount to release her from her remaining obligations. They agreed. She was 25 years old, and her career was, in all practical terms, finished. She made 2 more films for other studios, including a Fox production for which she was paid $150,000, an acknowledgement of what she had always been worth, and then retired at 28 to a Nevada ranch with her husband Rex Bell. She raised her sons. She found, in the quiet of the Nevada desert, the peace that Hollywood had made entirely impossible. Mornings with her boys, evenings watching the light change over the Joshua trees, a life that belonged to her rather than to the machine that had consumed her. What Hollywood took from Clara Bow was not primarily her money, though it took that too. What it took was her 20s, her health, the decade of her life that should have been her greatest. She had made Paramount a fortune. In return, they gave her a salary, a scandal, and a breakdown. She gave them everything she had. She left with what they hadn't managed to reach, her dignity, her family, and the permanent fact of what she had been. Tom Mix. Our next star left Hollywood carrying something even more tangible. He carried it in a suitcase. Tom Mix was the first cowboy king of Hollywood, and for a period in the early 1920s, he may have been the most straightforwardly successful performer in the American film industry. Not the most artistic, not the most critically celebrated, but the most commercially dominant in his particular corner of the market. A corner that turned out to be very large indeed. At the peak of his earning power, Mix received $17,000 per week, a figure that exceeded, at the time, the weekly earnings of the President of the United States. The Mixville studio complex on his own land was the physical embodiment of this success. The mansion on Sunset Boulevard announced his arrival in the most literal terms available. A neon sign above the property spelled out his name in lights visible from the street below. The custom automobiles were each more extravagant than the last. His horse Tony, a genuinely gifted animal performer, beloved by audiences, was stabled in accommodations that most working Americans would have envied for themselves. Those who worked alongside Mix described a man of genuine generosity, someone who paid his crew well, above the going rate, who remembered birthdays, who once quietly covered the medical bills of a stuntman injured on one of his productions when the studio refused to do so. The transition to sound disrupted his career, and Mix responded by taking his show on the road. Literally, he invested in a traveling circus that bore his name and toured America during the 1930s, an enterprise that proved far more expensive to operate than it was profitable to run. Multiple marriages extracted further financial tolls. The stock market collapse of 1929 wiped out investments meant to provide security. By the late 1930s, Mix was performing in small touring rodeo shows, a long distance from Mixville and the Sunset Boulevard Neon. On the 12th of October, 1940, Tom Mix was driving through the Arizona desert when his car left the road. The accident claimed his life. When investigators examined the wreckage, they found, beside the driver, a single suitcase. Inside it, $6,000 in cash, some pieces of jewelry, and very little else. The man who had once owned a studio complex, a mansion with a neon sign, and a stable of custom automobiles had been, in his final years, living on what he could carry. The suitcase is the whole story, contained in a single image. The neon sign, $17,000 a week. The Mixville empire, all of it reduced to a leather case on the seat of a car in the Arizona desert. It is one of the quietest, most complete endings in Hollywood history. Billie Burke, our next star, left no such tidy symbol. She left something harder to carry. 30 years of work performed in service of a debt she had not created. When the curtain rose on Broadway's most celebrated productions in the years before the First World War, there was one name that reliably filled houses on both sides of the Atlantic. Billie Burke was not merely a popular actress. She was a theatrical phenomenon, a luminous, witty, technically accomplished performer whose combination of beauty and comic timing made her, for a period, the most sought-after stage actress in the English-speaking world. Then she married Florenz Ziegfeld. Ziegfeld was the most famous theatrical producer in America, a man whose name on a production guaranteed spectacle and talent. He was also a man who spent money with a freedom that bore no relationship to the money available to be spent. Billie Burke, who had retired from performing to become his wife, was largely insulated from the details of these financial habits until the summer of 1932, when Florenz Ziegfeld passed away and she discovered what the insulation had been protecting her from. The debts were approximately $1 million, an almost unimaginable sum in the depths of the Great Depression. Burke was 47 years old. She had been out of professional performance for years, and she had, it turned out, an obligation that she seems to have regarded not as a burden, but as a commitment. Because Florenz Ziegfeld had been her husband, and his debts were, therefore, her responsibility. She went back to work. She took every role offered. In 1939, The Wizard of Oz offered her the part of Glinda, the Good Witch of the North. Billie Burke put on the pink gown and the crown and the wand and delivered a performance of such warmth and grace that it became, for subsequent generations, the definitive image of goodness in American cinema. She continued working steadily through the 1940s and 50s. She wrote plainly in her memoir about why. The debts, she said, had taken 30 years to retire. She had retired them, every dollar. The woman the world knows as Glinda the Good Witch spent 3 decades performing an act of extraordinary, largely unrecognized devotion. She had been one of Broadway's greatest stars. She became Ziegfeld's widow and his creditor's unwilling benefactor. And she did it with such grace that no one watching her in any of those years would have guessed the obligation driving her. The goodness she played on screen was not, it turns out, very far from the goodness she displayed in life. Barbara Payton. Not every story on this list ends with the quiet dignity of Billie Burke. Some of them end faster and harder than anyone watching could have anticipated. In the spring of 1950, the executives at Universal Pictures were genuinely excited about a new actress they had under contract. Barbara Payton was 22 years old, possessed of a beauty that the camera embraced completely, and appeared to have the natural screen presence that studios spent years trying to develop in performers who simply did not have it. The projections for her career were optimistic. Her trajectory seemed clear. 18 months later, that trajectory was gone. The circumstances involved a public altercation between two men, actor Tom Neal and the considerably more established Franchot Tone, over Payton's affections. The fight was brutal, it was public, and it made international headlines of exactly the kind that studio publicity departments existed to prevent. Tone was hospitalized with a broken cheekbone and a broken nose. Universal terminated Payton's contract with an efficiency that suggested the decision had been waiting for exactly this kind of justification. The question that everyone who encountered Payton during the years that followed came back to was not how it happened so fast. It was why the industry watched it happen and did nothing. She had been their investment. The moment she became inconvenient, she became invisible. The smaller film productions dried up. The studio infrastructure that had briefly surrounded her, the publicists, the managers, the machinery of support that made careers possible, evaporated completely, and there was nothing underneath it. Within 5 years of the Universal signing, Payton was destitute. The financial depletion that came with having no studio support and no steady income. The dependency that took hold during the years when everything else was falling away. The particular cruelty of a fall that happened in public, in an industry that watched and moved on. Those who encountered her during this period spoke of a woman who still carried herself with a remnant of the presence that had made the studios notice her in the first place. Someone who had not forgotten what she had been, even when everything around her insisted she forget. She eventually wrote a memoir. She called it, "I Am Not Ashamed," and she meant it with a literalness that was remarkable given what it cost her to mean it. The book documented her fall with an honesty that was almost confrontational, not self-pitying, not evasive, but clear-eyed and direct in a way that suggested Payton had decided that the one thing the industry had not managed to take from her was her own account of what had happened. She passed away in 1967 at the age of 39. The rise from unknown to signed Universal actress had taken roughly 2 years. The fall from there to destitution had taken less than 1. In the entire history of Golden Age Hollywood, it is difficult to find a collapse that happened that fast. Her memoir remains. It is honest and unsparing and entirely her own. In an industry that spent decades manufacturing the stories of its stars, Barbara Payton told her own story exactly as it had happened, without apology. That courage deserves to be recognized now. If you have been moved by these stories, if the women and men we have met today feel worth remembering, we would love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments which story has stayed with you most. And tell us what Golden Age Hollywood topic you would like us to explore next. We read every comment, and your suggestions shape what this channel covers. A&E Sheridan Warner Brothers had a policy. If you objected to a role, if you pushed back, if you asked for better material, if you declined an assignment you considered beneath your talent, they stopped paying you. They called it suspension. They could do it as many times as they chose. A&E Sheridan was suspended repeatedly. Each suspension cost her months of income. Each time she returned to work when they permitted it, because the contract gave her no alternative. This is what it meant to be the oomph girl. Sheridan had arrived at Warner Brothers in the mid-1930s as a contract player among many. But by the early 1940s, she had become something considerably more than that. The studio had plastered her image across wartime promotional materials that made her one of the most recognized faces in America. Soldiers carried her photograph. Her name appeared on the side of a military aircraft. Her roles alongside James Cagney and Humphrey Bogart confirmed that she could hold the screen with the best that Warner Brothers had to offer. Not as decoration, but as an equal. Someone whose timing and intelligence matched theirs scene for scene. She was a genuine star, and Warners knew exactly what she was worth to them. What the Oomph Girl nickname did not convey was the arrangement underneath it. The name had been invented by a studio publicist, not by Sheridan, and she had no say in whether it followed her or what it implied about the kind of performer she was. Her contract fixed her salary at a rate that bore no relationship to her commercial value. The studio owned her time. They decided her roles. When she pushed back, and she did push back, more than once, because she understood better than anyone what she was capable of and what she was being asked to settle for. The suspension came down, and the income stopped. The message was always the same. You will work on our terms, or you will not work at all. Sheridan went back to work. Every time. The suspension system ensured that the power in the relationship never shifted in her direction. Those who worked alongside her consistently described a woman of remarkable wit and warmth. Someone who kept difficult sets light with a quick humor that never came at anyone else's expense. Who mentored younger contract players with a generosity the studio had never asked her to show and did not compensate her for showing. There are accounts of Sheridan sitting with frightened newcomers between takes, talking them through scenes, giving freely the kind of guidance that no one had thought to give her when she was the one just starting out. The studio manufactured the Oomph Girl. The actual woman, the one her colleagues knew and remembered, was something considerably more than that. And she gave that too, without a contract requiring it. When her Warner's years ended, the commercial heights she had reached proved difficult to replicate without the studio's promotional machinery behind her. The infrastructure that had made her face ubiquitous. The publicists, the magazine placements, the carefully managed visibility belonged to Warner's and stayed with Warner's. What Sheridan took with her was her talent, her professionalism, and the work ethic that had carried her through every suspension and every role she had deserved better than. Television offered work, and she took it, professional, reliable, committed to every project she accepted. She worked until she was unable to. Anne Sheridan passed away from cancer on the 21st of January, 1967, at the age of 51. She had sold millions of tickets and generated vast wealth for the studio that had manufactured her image and controlled her career. She left the world in modest circumstances, a considerable distance from what her talent and her box office record might have secured under different terms. The Oomph Girl's name still appears on the posters and promotional materials in archives across the country. The studio that put it there made certain the oomph belonged to them. The woman behind it always belonged entirely to herself. Veronica Lake. In 1962, a journalist walking through the Martha Washington Hotel in Midtown Manhattan stopped in the middle of the lobby. He had recognized the face of the woman carrying the cocktail tray. It was Veronica Lake, the most imitated woman in America. The actress whose peekaboo hairstyle had swept the country so completely during the war years that the government had asked her to change it, because women working in factories were catching their hair in the machinery, trying to replicate it. That woman, carrying a tray, in a hotel in Midtown Manhattan, not hiding, simply with nowhere else to be. To understand how she arrived at that lobby, you have to go back to Paramount in the early 1940s, to the peak of what she had been. The Alan Ladd pairings that had produced some of the studio's most commercially reliable pictures. The presence that made other actresses on the same lot take notice. The face that the cameras found endlessly compelling, and that the public, for a brilliant and concentrated window of years, simply could not resist. When her box office numbers dipped, Paramount made its decision with the brisk efficiency the studio system applied to all such decisions. The contract was not renewed. The promotional machinery that had made her face visible on every magazine cover in America was redirected toward the next contract player. The infrastructure of a career, the agents, the publicists, the managers whose livelihoods depended on her continued commercial viability, dissolved with remarkable speed. Beverly Hills gave way to increasingly modest addresses. The marriages that followed offered instability rather than security. By the early 1960s, Veronica Lake was working at the Martha Washington Hotel because it was work that was available, and she needed the income. The journalist who found her wrote about the encounter with a gentleness that suggested he understood what he was witnessing. She was composed. She did not appear to be ashamed. She asked him not to make too much of it. He made something of it anyway, because he was a journalist and the story was extraordinary. But he did so with a care for her dignity that the industry that had created and discarded her had never managed to show. Veronica Lake's story is not primarily about the cocktail tray. It is about the speed and the completeness with which an industry can withdraw its support from someone it has finished using. The hairstyle is still famous. The woman who wore it deserved better than the lobby of a midtown hotel. John Barrymore and Sheridan worked within the rules the studio set and lost anyway. Our next star made his own rules, spectacular, ruinous, magnificent rules, and lost on purpose and on his own extraordinary terms. The word that appears most consistently in accounts of John Barrymore's theatrical performances is definitive. His Hamlet, when he brought it to Broadway in the early 1920s, was described by critics as the finest interpretation of the role in living memory. His voice, his physical presence, the intelligence he brought to Shakespeare's most demanding material, all of it combined to produce something that the theatrical world had genuinely never encountered before. He was, by widespread consensus, the greatest actor of his generation. This was not a promotional claim. It was a professional assessment. The Tower Road estate in the Hollywood Hills was built to the scale of this assessment. Multiple structures spread across several acres. A main residence, guest houses, a bowling alley, a skeet shooting range, and a miniature golf course. The parties held at Tower Road became, over the years, a kind of parallel Hollywood history, a record of who was brilliant and celebrated and present in the great years of the studio era. The drinking was, by all accounts, itself a kind of performance, conducted with a theatrical commitment that matched anything Barrymore brought to the stage. By the late 1930s, the voice that had made Hamlet definitive was still extraordinary. But the memory that had held entire Shakespeare plays was failing. Studios began writing his dialogue on cue cards hidden throughout the set, on the backs of other actors' shoulders, on objects in the frame, wherever the camera's eye might plausibly miss them. Barrymore worked within these constraints with a professionalism that suggested he had made his peace with what they represented. Those who knew him in these final years spoke of a man who retained, beneath the physical deterioration, the full force of his intellect and his charm. Someone who could still hold a dinner table spellbound for hours, who remained genuinely curious about literature and art, who was capable of extraordinary kindness toward younger performers uncertain of their gifts. The Tower Road estate may have been crumbling around him. The The man inside it was not. He passed away in May of 1942 at the age of 60. The Tower Road estate was sold. The debts were settled. What remained was the work itself, the Hamlet that critics had called definitive, the films that demonstrated what a genuine theatrical intelligence brought to the camera, the voice that audiences across 5 decades had found simply incomparable. These things could not be sold to settle debts. They existed beyond the reach of creditors and accountants. Barrymore had spent everything he had on living as fully as he was capable of living. There are worse ways to go through life. The Tower Road estate is gone. The performances remain as vivid and irreducible as the day they were given. Lupe Velez. If Barrymore's story is tinged with a kind of grandeur, a magnificent ruin, a towering figure who built his own pyre and struck the match himself, the story of our next star carries a different quality entirely. It is quieter. It is sadder. And it is about what happens when an industry mistakes a person for a product. Before the production code tightened its grip on American cinema in the mid-1930s, there was a brief, remarkable period when Hollywood films were allowed to be genuinely alive, when characters could be complicated, when desire could be acknowledged, when performances could be raw and immediate in ways that the code years would make impossible. And in those years, no performer was more electric than Lupe Velez. She had come to Hollywood from Mexico in the late 1920s, and what she brought with her could not be taught or manufactured. A vitality, a humor, a refusal to be diminished that made audiences feel, in her presence, that anything might happen. Her romance with Gary Cooper was one of Hollywood's great public love stories. Her pre-code work gave her the material to demonstrate a range that went far beyond the comic persona that would later be forced upon her. RKO discovered that the Mexican Spitfire series was profitable and proceeded to make 8 of them. This was not an artistic decision. It was a commercial one, arrived at with the indifference to the performer's inner life that characterized the studio system at its least admirable. The series required Velez to play an exaggerated version of a single trait, a cartoon of a quality she actually possessed, and to repeat that performance with minor variations, film after film. Those who worked with her recalled a woman who brought her full professionalism to every production while finding the material increasingly difficult to reconcile with the performer she knew herself to be. She had arrived in Hollywood as something genuinely original. The studio had spent a decade methodically replacing that originality with a formula, and she had watched it happen with no contractual power to prevent it. The relationship with Harold Ramonde consumed her emotionally and financially in her final years. The funds that might have provided security were not there. In December of 1944, Lupe Velez passed away at her home in Beverly Hills. She was 36 years old. Her estate was modest. She was, when she had the material to demonstrate it, extraordinary. Hollywood gave her the Mexican Spitfire series and called the arrangement mutually beneficial. It was not. What it could not take, what no studio contract and no formulaic series could diminish, was the evidence of what she had actually been, preserved in the pre-code films that survive. In those frames, Lupe Velez is fully, irreducibly herself, alive, funny, fierce, and incapable of being anything less than completely present. That is the legacy. That is the name worth remembering. Before we reach our final story, if you have found this journey through Hollywood's hidden costs worth your time, if these 14 lives have meant something to you, please share this with someone who loves this era, and leave a life before we spend our last few minutes with a man who was, once, the most famous person in the world. Mickey Rooney. In 1939, if you had walked into any movie theater in America and asked the audience to name the single biggest star in Hollywood, the answer would not have been Clark Gable, though Gable was beloved. It would not have been Gary Cooper, though Cooper was admired. It would have been a 19-year-old from Brooklyn named Mickey Rooney, a young man of such extraordinary, multifaceted talent that even the most experienced industry veterans struggled to find an adequate comparison. He could act, sing, dance, perform physical comedy, and carry dramatic weight simultaneously. He was earning $5,000 a week in 1939, a figure that represented, in the currency of the Depression era, a form of wealth that most Americans could barely imagine. And he was worth every dollar of it and considerably more. He was the #1 box office attraction in America for 4 consecutive years. Above Gable, above Cooper, above every name the industry could offer. Mickey Rooney, in those years, was as close to a sure thing as the movie business has ever produced. The decades that followed were long and complicated in ways that no 19-year-old at the summit of his industry could have anticipated. 8 marriages, each with its own financial and emotional cost. The maintenance of a life built at a scale appropriate to the earnings of 1939, sustained through years when those earnings were no longer available. Las Vegas engagements taken to cover the gaps. The slow, grinding reality of a fortune that had once seemed inexhaustible, revealing that it was, in fact, exhaustible. And then, in his final years, something that was not the consequence of his own choices at all. A stepson gained control of Mickey Rooney's financial accounts. What followed was a methodical stripping of what remained, the redirection of funds, the accumulation of control, the isolation of an elderly man from the resources that should have sustained his final years. By the time the full extent of what had happened became clear, Rooney had been left, by his own account, unable to purchase food. In 2011, Mickey Rooney appeared before the United States Senate Special Committee on Aging. He was 90 years old. He sat at the witness table with the composure of a man who had spent decades performing before audiences and had not forgotten how to be present in a room. And he told the United States Senate what had been done to him, not with self-pity, not with bitterness, but with a directness and a dignity that made the testimony almost unbearable to hear. He said that he had been stripped of everything. He said that he had been rendered unable to take care of himself. He said these things clearly, on the record, in a room full of people who needed to understand what could be done to the elderly and the vulnerable. And he said them with his name and his face, and all that name and face had once meant to the world, meant to. The boy from Brooklyn who had made an entire nation laugh was now asking that same nation to pay attention. And it was the bravest performance of his life. Mickey Rooney passed away on the 6th of April, 2014, at the age of 93. His estate was valued at approximately $18,000, a figure so distant from the $5,000 a week of 1939 that the mind struggles to hold them in the same thought. The boy who had been the most famous person in the world left it with less than many Americans keep in a checking account. What his congressional testimony gave the world, beyond the legislative record, was something harder to legislate. Proof that the vulnerability he had described was real, and that speaking about it plainly and without shame was an act of courage. The 19-year-old who had made America laugh and cry at the same time had become, at 90, a man willing to stand before the Senate and say what needed to be said. Both versions of Mickey Rooney, the boy at the summit and the man at the witness table, were the same person. The talent was the same. The courage was the same. The money was the only thing that had changed. The work endures. Every frame, every performance, every name on this list. Permanent. Long after the studios that discarded them closed their doors. long after the contracts that underpaid them turned to dust, long after the people who decided they were finished were themselves forgotten. What these 14 human beings created cannot be owned, cannot be taken, and cannot be erased. The industry took what it could. It could not take that. And neither can time. This is the Golden Age Files. Subscribe, share this with someone who loves this era, and tell us in the comments which name you are still thinking about. We will see you in the next one.